Chapter 183. Leaving Blackstone, the Grand Mage's words triggered several reactions from the other men in the dining room. The mayor couldn't help but glance at the young man again, wondering if he had done something of great service to earn such favor from Mage Lion. Unfortunately, since he had no idea which noble family Michael hailed from, he couldn't afford to curry favor beyond what he had already done for the Grand Mage, who, at least, was a recognized figure of the kingdom. For the mayor, this was frustrating. He had built his career by knowing how to flatter and serve his superiors, but now he was in the dark. The knight captain, on the other hand, was more intrigued than frustrated. He had already suspected that the old mage held this young man in high regard, and now it was confirmed. If it were him, he would do the same. The knight captain wasn't arrogant enough to claim he was all-knowing, but as someone of high status in the kingdom, he was well informed. He had encountered the peak powers of the kingdom on several occasions and had even undertaken missions with Mage Lion in the past. From what he had seen of Michael's performance the previous night, the youth's power was at least on par with a Grand Mage. That alone was enough to be impressive, but what made it even more astonishing was his age. A person this young possessing such strength was beyond rare. The knight captain even entertained the possibility that Michael was an old man disguising himself as a youth, a trick some powerful individuals could pull off. However, habits and behavior were much harder to fake. Michael didn't act childish, nor was he overly arrogant. His serious and reserved demeanor fit that of a noble young master rather than a wizened old man in disguise. But what truly shocked both the mayor and the knight captain were the words Mage Lion had just spoken. The Duke of Evermoon competition. Everyone in Lionheart knew about it. At least 7 out of 10 citizens were aware of its significance. The event was that prestigious. Even though most people knew they would never have anything to do with it in their lifetimes, it didn't stop them from paying attention. The mayor spared Michael a few more curious glances, but the knight captain's reaction was different. His expression turned oddly contemplative. The competition's entry requirements were notoriously strict. Candidates had to be under the age of 25 and possess the strength of an intermediate-level powerhouse. In practical terms, that meant having the combat ability equivalent to a deputy captain of a Kingdom Knight squad. Most people couldn't even dream of reaching that level, yet this youth had not only met the criteria, he had far exceeded them. To be honest, even with the competition's grand prize, the marriage of the princess, this young man was already more than qualified to be a contender. As Michael was pleasantly surprised by Mage Lion's invitation, he had no idea that his words had sent the other men into deep contemplation. However, even though this was his goal, he knew he couldn't afford to show too much excitement. Maintaining a composed demeanor, he responded steadily. "If it doesn't trouble you, Mage Lion, I'd be glad to join you on your journey. At the very least, it's better than wandering around alone in an unfamiliar place." Michael made sure to emphasize the last part of his sentence. There was a reason for that. Only he truly understood just how little he knew about this world. If he didn't establish early on that he was ignorant of his surroundings because he wasn't from around here, it would be far too easy for someone sharp to see through his act. He might have been overthinking things, but he preferred to be cautious. Mage Lion nodded in satisfaction. The more he interacted with this young man, the more he found himself liking him. Despite possessing enough power to match a Grand Mage, even without his summon, assuming he could manipulate his mana in other ways, Michael remained polite and well-mannered. Compared to the king's son, who was undoubtedly talented but also insufferably arrogant, Mage Lion found Michael to be far more pleasant company. Thinking about the possibility of the prince and Michael clashing in the future, especially since the prince also had his eyes on the princess, the Duke of Evermoon's daughter, Mage Lion's smile grew even more genuine. "It's no issue at all, Sir Mike. You might not be aware, but the competition is being held in the capital region of the kingdom, so traveling with us will only get you to your destination faster." Michael's eyes lit up for a brief moment at those words, a reaction that did not go unnoticed by Mage Lion. The old mage chuckled inwardly. Even if Michael had spoken about the competition as though it were just a casual event, his reaction made it clear. He was definitely looking forward to it. Of course, that wasn't the case. Michael had no interest in the Duke of Evermoon's competition, at least not in the way the others assumed. Instead, he was simply relieved that it provided him with a convenient excuse to integrate better into this world. So, in a way, he hadn't been lying when he told Mage Lion he'd give the competition a try. If he did end up competing, it would only be to try. Ironically, the grand prize, the princess's hand in marriage, was more of a reason not to compete than a reason to participate. He didn't like the idea of marriage as a grand prize. Even a corpse would be better. "Then permit me to trouble you on this journey, Mage Lion," Michael said with a slight smile. Mage Lion responded with a hearty laugh. After that, only a few more words were exchanged at the dining table before everyone finished their last bites of breakfast. However, even though the meal was over, the table was still filled with food. The powerful in this world sure know how to enjoy themselves, Michael thought. Growing up in poverty back in Aurora, he had always made sure his plate was spotless before even thinking about washing it. He could never afford to waste food like the rich did, ordering expensive meals in restaurants only to take a single bite before pushing the rest aside. That being said, Michael didn't judge such people. It was simply a different way of life. After all, he had just done the same, and it hadn't felt particularly wrong or out of place. Still, he felt a little better when he saw the excitement on the faces of the mayor's staff as they came in to clear the table, their gazes lingering on the untouched food. Michael figured the leftovers were a treat for them, while some untouched items, like the fruits, would likely be returned to storage for future use. If that was how things worked, then at least it was good management. Soon, all the men made their way out of the dining room and under Michael's gaze, out of the town mayor's residence. From the conversation around him, Michael knew they were finally about to leave town, which made him quite excited. However, what he hadn't expected was that after joining up with the other knights, who looked much better than they had the previous night, at least in terms of appearance, Mage Lion and the knight captain led them far away from the settlement, deeper into a small wilderness. As they continued forward, Michael grew increasingly confused and cautious. Still, despite his uncertainty about what was happening, he didn't speak up. Instead, he simply followed their lead, wondering where exactly they were taking him. Fortunately, he didn't have to wait long for an answer. Before they even reached a wide clearing, Michael spotted something massive in the distance, a huge, ship-like object. "Is that a ship?" It certainly looked like one, but even setting aside how expensive such a thing must be, why would a ship of all things be in the middle of nowhere? Extremely curious but maintaining his composure, Michael kept his calm all the way until he stood before the vessel, finally able to take in its full glory. It was massive. It seemed to be made of wood, yet oddly, its natural color appeared to be black rather than something painted over. At the same time, the texture gave the illusion of metal rather than wood. A massive lion head insignia was emblazoned on its hull. After taking a quick glance at everything, Michael hesitated no longer and used detect on the ship before him. Meanwhile, as Michael made his way deeper into civilization in the land of origin, back in the real world, Aunt Mia stood at her doorstep, staring at the two girls and the boy before her with a puzzled expression. "You're saying the three of you are my nephew's friends?" she asked suspiciously, he never knew his mother. They said she died after giving birth to him. However, after years, he started to believe otherwise. His father, Brian, had conflicting thoughts about him. His father treated him more seriously than anything in the world, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only because of how useful he was. Or rather, how unique he was. But even as the feeling of being treated as a tool deepened with age, Brian couldn't help but find himself wanting to follow his father's wishes and win his favor. The first time he killed, he was 7. His father praised him. It made Brian happy despite the conflicting emotions within him. But as he grew stronger, killing ordinary people no longer satisfied his father. That made Brian anxious. This was the only man he cared about in the world. The others around his father only respected him from afar and rarely interacted with him. Though his father's actions changed as he grew older, Brian still remembered the days they played together. He longed for those days. The only remnant of that time was the rare moments when he did something that satisfied his father, earning a simple rub on the head. It didn't matter how old he got. He still wanted that man's acknowledgement. Fortunately, he was special. A natural mage from birth, blessed with great knightly talent. For the sake of his father's mission, he never abandoned his knight training, but he slowed it down, ensuring that stronger supernaturals wouldn't sense anything odd about him. However, while he limited his growth as a mage, he never stopped accumulating knowledge. Even against a mage apprentice of the same rank, he wouldn't lose. That wasn't the uniqueness of mage battles. Sometimes it wasn't just about raw power. Of course, overwhelming strength was valuable, but wielding it with knowledge was even more dangerous. In an evenly matched battle, it became a contest of knowledge. Whoever could apply their understanding of magic better would win. And yes, not only was Brian a knight, he was also a mage. All of this before awakening. What did that mean? Stepping into the official role of a cultivator almost guaranteed a second class, so long as it wasn't the same as their previous profession. But Brian's case was different. His affinity for fire wasn't even his best, though it was his second highest. His greatest affinity was with the wind. Yes, Brian didn't awaken one class. He didn't awaken 2. Instead, he awakened 3. The Night class, the Fire Mage class, the Wind Mage class. 2 rare classes and 1 common grade. But only he knew. Even if a fellow awakener used detect on him, they would only see his profession as a fire mage, never the other 2. From that moment, it was just as his teachers in school had thought. A talented being became even more of a genius. They were right, but they were also wrong. Brian wasn't just a genius who became even more of a genius. He was a monster. However, this realization didn't bring him much happiness when he first discovered it. It was only when his father praised him with a loud laugh and pulled him into a hug that he truly felt amazing. Though he could see the deepening gaze in his father's eyes, the gaze that saw him as nothing more than a tool, Brian no longer cared. He was already coming to accept that only those who could bring benefits truly mattered. You said you're my nephew's friends. Brian glanced at the woman in front of him. She was ridiculously weak. But he still kept up his public persona. Not just because he had to maintain it long-term for his father's plan, but also because something within the apartment behind her made his heart shake. With his heightened senses as a mage, he could detect 4 strong presences behind the door. 3 of them made his heart tremble slightly. Aside from Myra, the girl with a special class and good talent, whom he already had plans for, he had believed they were the only unique awakeners in Woodstone City. Yet now, what was this power? He had already sensed it from outside. Those undead. Who was this Michael they spoke of? How could he be this powerful? No, how could he be so much stronger than him? Yet despite the storm of thoughts flashing through his mind, Brian showed no reaction. Even after hearing the blatant lie, the woman in front of him spoke. "Sorry, my nephew is currently busy, and I have no idea where he is." In the end, the trio had no choice but to leave Michael's community. They had gotten his address from the principal, who had gathered all living awakeners for an important announcement, but unsurprisingly, they were unable to meet Michael. The girls had thought this was a good chance to check up on him and discuss things, but they were unsuccessful. As for the aunt's words, putting aside their method, she was a terrible liar. They didn't believe her. As rank 1 awakeners with enhanced senses, they could tell Michael was inside. But sensing that he remained stationary, his presence intertwined with a familiar undead aura, they figured he was likely in the land of origin. And since they couldn't force their way in, they gave up. Michael had no idea his classmates had come to visit his home and instead remained focused, staring at the massive ship before him in awe. Flying ship. That, along with a few other details, was all that Detect had given him. After collecting more information, Michael began to notice even more about the ship. Increasing his senses as he stepped closer, he detected faint magical waves pulsing from it. In fact, it felt as if the entire ship was coated in mana. "What does Sir Mike think of it?" A familiar voice spoke beside him. Michael turned his head slightly. It was Mage Lion. He paused for a moment, then responded. "It's quite the sight," he said before hesitating briefly. Taking a small risk, he added, "It seems to be quite a capable flying ship." There was a reason for this. In the land of origin, he would inevitably use Detect. If he didn't want to appear completely ignorant, there were certain things he should be expected to know. Like this flying ship. As a noble, it was only natural that he should recognize something like this, right? And as for whether the ship was truly a capable tool, considering it belonged to knights serving directly under the kingdom and royal family, it shouldn't be anything inferior. Besides, its appearance alone spoke volumes. Fortunately, it seemed his words were acceptable. Mage Lion flashed a pleased smile. "Sir Mike is indeed a man of great sight." Michael's lips twitched slightly, but he said nothing in response. Luckily, Mage Lion didn't push the topic further. Instead, he turned to look toward the knight captain, who wasn't too far away. "Make haste and start the ship. We must reach the capital soon." The knight captain didn't hesitate any longer and immediately began instructing the knights who could still move. Michael watched as the magic users among them cast spells, opening a hole in the ship's wall before helping everyone inside. The interior was spacious. Glowing stones embedded in the walls illuminated the surroundings, casting a soft, steady light. From its external appearance alone, Michael had already guessed that the ship had multiple floors, and he was right. It had 5. The third floor housed the rooms for VIP guests, one of which had been assigned to him. However, he didn't settle there immediately. Instead, he followed Mage Lion to the top deck. Mage Lion had invited him not just to witness the ship's takeoff, but, Michael suspected, for a conversation. The old mage hadn't spoken about the departure itself as anything particularly grand. Instead, his invitation felt like a perfect excuse to spend time together and talk. Michael wasn't too keen on conversation. He could tell Mage Lion was curious about him, but he preferred to be the one listening rather than speaking. He still didn't trust himself not to slip up. Still, refusing outright wasn't an option. Not when the old mage had gone out of his way to personally visit Michael's room, bowing as he extended the invitation. Besides, Michael was somewhat curious about the ship's takeoff. And so, before long, He found himself standing atop the flying ship, gazing at the vast blue sky stretching endlessly before him. Michael admired the seemingly empty sky. For some reason, he was starting to enjoy this feeling, standing at the top, gazing down at the world below. Just as he continued taking in the vast expanse before him, Mage Lion, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Sir Mike, I wonder if you'd be interested in a certain opportunity." Michael immediately became cautious. He didn't let it show on his face and responded as usual. "And what kind of opportunity would that be?" he inquired. "A chance to obtain a soul pool fruit." "A soul magic pool fruit?" Michael couldn't help but show a hint of confusion. Mage Lion, however, didn't seem particularly surprised by his reaction. "It seems Sir Mike hasn't heard of this natural treasure." "That's not surprising, it's incredibly rare. The soul magic pool fruit is something that can significantly enhance both the quality and quantity of mana, even for people like us. But I read in a record that its true value lies elsewhere." Michael listened attentively as Mage Lion's tone deepened. "It also strengthens the soul itself. In fact, that's considered its primary effect. Though the soul is something that mainly great mages and knights dabble in, it's still very beneficial." Michael had already been feeling uneasy the moment Mage Lion spoke. However, when he heard the name of the treasure, his worry was quickly replaced by intrigue. Great knights, great mages. He had no idea what level of power these titles represented in this world. Even now, he still didn't have a clear understanding of what the soul was, but he did have something closely related to it: his talent. To be fair, it would be incorrect to say his talent was directly reliant on his soul, since he had never felt himself interacting with this supernatural existence. But as someone still ignorant about the deeper workings of the supernatural world, he wasn't about to draw his own conclusions. However, there was one thing an increase in his soul could definitely help with: more contract slots. More contract slots meant more undead. More undead meant more evolution points. More evolution points meant more powerful and diverse undead. It was an endlessly beneficial cycle. Gaining 2 contract slots per level wasn't bad. There were times Michael had questioned what kind of crippled class this was, especially when he struggled with the frustration of lacking evolution points. But once he calmed down, he always realized that wasn't the case. Just because necromancers were necromancers didn't mean they couldn't act like mages. In essence, it functioned like any other mage class, except with an additional ability that allowed it to sustain itself. The inability to control infinite undead didn't make the class weaker either. If necromancers could command an infinite number of undead, the class wouldn't be classified as a rare one. It would be unique. Anyone with foresight could see the terrifying potential of this class. So what if you were limited to a few contract slots? If you could fill them with undead just as powerful as yourself, would you even need more? Of course, as one grew stronger, such powerful undead would become increasingly difficult to find and kill. But who was to say that high-level necromancers hadn't fully manifested the potential of their class after centuries of existence? One could only imagine the level of power such individuals would possess. It certainly wouldn't be easy, but if achieved, even if it didn't make one the absolute strongest, it would be hard to say if anyone of the same rank could defeat them. And the current Michael was the perfect example of that potential. "It can enhance the soul?" he finally asked. "I believe so," Mage Lion replied. "This is a treasure I read about in the kingdom's library years ago. I just didn't think I'd actually encounter it on my recent adventure." Michael narrowed his eyes slightly. "Why aren't you keeping it for yourself?" That was the real question, wasn't it? Why would someone willingly share such an amazing treasure? At least he wouldn't. Why would he? It was obvious Mage Lion hadn't told him everything yet. And Michael was right. It's protected by two powerful monsters, Mage Lion admitted. I asked my fellow Grand Mage and 3 other Grand Knights to assist me, but they either had their own priorities or didn't want to take the risk. How strong are these monsters? Michael asked. Mage Lion's answer was simple and without hesitation. Stronger than me. Michael had a peculiar expression on his face. What kind of monsters could be stronger than Mage Lion? They would have to be at least level 30, but even then, that shouldn't be enough to stop someone of Mage Lion's caliber. These monsters had to be significantly stronger. Maybe even 10 levels higher. That was a power level far beyond what Michael could handle. He could finally see why Mage Lion was willing to share this treasure. He wasn't strong enough to claim it on his own. But Michael still had his doubts. Why not ask these great mages and knights? He asked. Michael wasn't sure how strong these individuals were, but based on the way Mage Lion had spoken about them, his choice of words, and the fact that their power had a ranked classification, it was clear they were formidable. What he wasn't sure of was just how formidable. Were great mages still ranked 2 supernaturals, just in the later stages? Or were they something else entirely? Yes, they could help, but let's just say I might end up working as a treasure finder instead, Mage Lion said awkwardly, his expression turning odd. I was planning to meet them before I met you, though. His words immediately made everything click for Michael. I see, this isn't the Federation. It's probably the law of the jungle here, or at the very least, the strongest are respected and treated as lords. Even someone as strong as Mage Lion has to follow this rule to a certain extent. If the soul magic fruit was a treasure that could benefit those powerful figures, it was questionable whether Mage Lion would even get a share. Rather than risk that, it was probably a safer bet to collaborate with Michael, who, at least on the surface, didn't seem to have a massive power difference from him. Though Mage Lion suspected Michael might have more than one undead, he didn't think it was possible for him to have more than one of that powerful wolf he had seen. At most 2, and even that was pushing it. He didn't know much about summoning, but he did know that nothing came easy in this world. And he was right, except he was wrong about Michael. Michael didn't just have one monster capable of fighting rank 2 monsters. He didn't even have 2. He had 3. Michael thought for a moment, just about to reply to Mage Lion when he suddenly froze. Mage Lion noticed the shift immediately. What happened? He asked. Before Michael could answer, something else happened, something that made Mage Lion and the other knights on the deck stiffen in alarm. A sharp expletive slipped from Michael's lips. Fucking. There was a very good reason for his sudden change in reaction. Your undead has killed You've gained Yes. Michael was receiving notifications. His undead were killing something. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was, even though he hadn't given them names, it was easy for him to recognize which undead were doing the killing. And it wasn't the ones in the real world. Michael's expression darkened. He had somehow forgotten to recall his undead from the land of origin. If Michael had to pick a reason why he forgot his plan to transfer his undead from the land of origin to the real world, it would be because of how carried away he got while cultivating a few hours ago. Everything after that, up until his return to the land of origin, had felt so smooth that he had simply forgotten. Is something the matter, Sir Mike? Mage Lion had an odd expression on his face. This was the first time he had ever seen the usually composed Michael looking, well, not composed at all. Apparently, even in the land of origin, the F-word still retained its purpose. What a special world. It's nothing. Something just came up, Michael said after calming himself down. He turned to Mage Lion and added, "Also, we'll talk about the soul fruit again. I agree to follow you." Michael had given it some thought, and though he still felt it was a risk, he also saw it as an opportunity, just as Mage Lion had said. If he could get his hands on that fruit, and it worked the way he suspected it would, Michael couldn't help but imagine a massive increase in his strength in the near future. However, as tempting as it was to think about, he wasn't in a position to dwell on it right now. Mage Lion felt a sense of relief at Michael's agreement, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why did Michael still seem to be in a strange mood? Michael had said something had come up, but what? They were currently high in the sky, and Mage Lion hadn't sensed anything. He was just about to inquire when Michael spoke first. "Can Mage Lion please tell the ship to wait for a while?" Michael asked, his expression odd. The fact that he was still receiving notifications meant his undead were currently fighting something. And that worried him. Even if the situation wasn't too serious, he wouldn't feel at ease unless he was there. Not only were his undead an investment and a part of his strength, but they were also his primary source of evolution points. Losing even half his army, especially now, right before he was about to gain another round of evolution points, wasn't something he could afford. The thought of having to rebuild everything from scratch if he lost them. Absolutely miserable. Though Michael was conflicted about the possibility of his decision negatively affecting his current progress in the land of origin, his undead, no matter how weak they were right now, were just as important. As expected, Mage Lion glanced at Michael with a hint of suspicion before speaking. "I'm sorry, Sir Mike, but we can't stop the ship from moving. However, we can slow it down for a period of time." "That's fine, I won't take long," Michael interrupted. At the end of the day, neither of them was extremely familiar with the other. The fact that Mage Lion was even willing to slow the ship down for him was already a decent outcome. "Okay," Mage Lion finally nodded. From Michael's words, it was obvious that he intended to leave the ship. This made Mage Lion slightly wary, but after thinking it over, he decided to extend a little more trust. That said, he would only slow the ship for a short period before resuming full speed, whether or not he liked this youth or thought he could help him achieve his goal. This was why he wasn't too concerned about Michael leaving. Even though Michael now knew about the soul fruit, he didn't know its exact location. And no one, unless they were willing to go to war with Lionheart, could force him, a grand mage of the kingdom, to reveal it. Worst case scenario, he'd simply resort to his original plan and ask the kingdom's most powerful individuals for assistance. "Okay then, Sir Mike. We'll continue heading straight but not as fast as before. We'll slow the speed to the bare minimum, but only for half an hour. Please make sure to return within that time, or you might not be able to find us when you come back," Mage Lion stated, adding a warning. Then he asked, "How will you get down, though?" Despite asking, Mage Lion felt like he already knew the answer. As a fellow Grand Mage, he believed there was a high possibility that Michael had some form of flying magic. Even knights at his stage possessed such abilities, so it would be strange if Michael didn't. Though it couldn't compare to the natural flight abilities of a flying monster, it was still very useful. However, it wasn't until a second later that Mage Lion realized just how mistaken he was. "There's no need to worry about that. I've got it covered," Michael said. As he spoke, his hand was already outstretched. Out of nowhere, a being came into existence in midair. It was a black griffin. It soared into the sky. It circled the flying ship once before slowing down. Michael waved at Mage Lion and the other knights watching him, then leaped off the ship. His undead griffin flapped its wings hard, catching him with ease before disappearing into the distance. To the knights, who knew nothing about his true destination, It simply looked like he was heading back toward the town they had just left. However, the one thing all of them had in common was shock. First, the sudden appearance of a flying undead had caught them off guard. Second, its aura. Why did that monster's presence feel so overwhelming? Even when compared to a grand mage, it didn't seem to lose out by much. That was the thought running through the minds of most of the knights. But among them all, Mage Lion was the most shocked. Just moments ago, he had been certain that it would be difficult for Michael to summon another powerful creature. What he never expected was to be proven wrong so soon. Michael didn't care what the people on the flying ship thought of him. He also didn't care that they now knew he had another undead. For one, it was unavoidable given the current circumstances. But more importantly, he figured there was no reason to hide it. Michael wasn't the type to flaunt his powers unnecessarily, nor was he the type to conceal them when there was no need. From his observations, none of the knights had shown even the slightest hint of disgust at the sight of his undead. He attributed this to a few possible reasons. One, undead creatures were probably common in this part of the land of origin, so their existence wasn't something that disturbed the locals. Two, magic involving undead wasn't forbidden here. Three, if the first two weren't true, then the knights were simply seasoned warriors who had seen enough to remain unfazed by something like this. Another possibility, one that seemed very likely, was that his powers had been misunderstood in his favor. Regardless of the reason, it didn't seem like a bad thing for him. Considering that, why shouldn't he use his most convenient undead? As he rode on the back of his undead griffin, Michael couldn't help but feel pleased that he had acquired a flying undead. If he hadn't, he would have faced a tough choice. Either abandon his undead and continue with Mage Lion's group, or prioritize his undead and abandon following them altogether. And even if he had chosen the latter, his running speed wasn't anywhere near as fast as this griffin's flight. It was truly a stroke of luck that he had obtained this undead at the perfect time. Gripping tightly onto the griffin's head as they sped through the sky, leaving no trace behind thanks to its subconscious use of wind magic, Michael swiftly reached the outskirts of Blackstone Town. Without hesitation, he re-entered the Everlong Forest. Entering the familiar-looking forest instantly put Michael on edge. He knew that somewhere in this vast expanse of trees lurked a monster capable of killing him. Though he had grown much stronger than he was a few days ago, it was clear from the previous actions of this creature that he wasn't the only one improving. Who was to say that even with his newfound strength, his survival wouldn't just be a matter of delaying the inevitable? So yes, even though Michael doubted the monster would be roaming the outskirts at this exact moment, he remained cautious. After all, its ability to control other monsters meant its awareness wasn't confined to a single location. Michael's priority was simple: retrieve his undead, take them back to the real world and return. Right now, the use of power in the real world was so unrestricted that he didn't have to worry about causing mass panic. At most, his house might turn into some kind of amusement attraction. If only he had a place in the land of origin to hide his undead, Michael wouldn't have minded that some of them weren't here. After I'm done with the main tasks here, I'll use undead summoning on all my unsummoned undead. Hopefully, with some luck, I can increase my number of summons and reduce the number of undead I have to reveal outside. As several thoughts raced through his mind, Michael didn't hesitate. He continued toward the location where he had left his undead. There he was met with silence. A part of him had already expected this when the notifications of his undead killing monsters had stopped earlier. However, seeing the remains of the slain monsters littering the ground only made him frown. Though his system panel confirmed he hadn't lost any undead, he was surprised to find that very few of them were even injured. His newer summons, such as the armored cricket and spectral ant, were completely intact. Only his stronger undead, like the orcs, seemed to be in rough shape. Yet, as he observed how they had organized the remains of the monsters while cleaning up the battlefield, an odd expression crept onto Michael's face. They're probably just as smart, if not a bit smarter, than the ones I left back in the real world. Though this was good news, he didn't have time to celebrate. His gaze shifted to one of the nearby monster corpses. Corrupted Controlled Monster, LV-15. This was about the average level of the others as well. The system didn't even bother listing their names. If Michael wanted to identify them, he would have to do so manually, but he wasn't particularly interested in going that deep. And the reason was simple. Each of the monsters had black tentacles covering their bodies. Mage Lion's guess seems to be wrong. Perhaps that monster truly has no knowledge of the nearby settlement, but it definitely has its sights set on the forest. As for its intentions, they likely aren't good for anyone but itself. As Michael considered this, he didn't remain idle. While still midair, he mentally commanded all his undead to stop handling the monster corpses immediately. For a brief moment, he considered descending to inspect one of the bodies himself, but he quickly dismissed the thought. He wanted nothing to do with that monster. At least not yet. After this was done, still in mid-air, he commanded all his undead to rush out of the forest. From his previous experience, whenever the minions of that monster died, it would send others to retrieve the bodies. If those creatures caught up to him here, Michael would have no choice but to fight, something he wanted to avoid. Though he wouldn't admit it, he wasn't confident he could escape a second time if he faced that monster again. Ironically, in the land of origin, death was usually the least frightening thing for awakeners. Yet for Michael, it was a different story. The only thing capable of killing him here also seemed capable of killing him for real. While Michael knew that his rough start was largely due to his luck not being the best, it didn't make him feel any better. Michael made his way out of the everlong forest without any issues, but even then, his expression remained grim. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching him while he was inside, yet no matter how hard he tried, he hadn't been able to spot anything or anyone. Michael didn't think his instincts were wrong. Perhaps they could be, but with everything going on, he'd rather be overly cautious than dismiss his suspicions. Even though he and his group of undead had successfully left the forest, they didn't move anywhere near Blackstone Town. Instead, Michael carefully guided them around it, using his flying insect undead to scout ahead and avoid people. It wasn't until they reached a secluded spot that he finally stopped. Since leaving the forest, he had turned his flying mount to a land-based one, ensuring that he wouldn't need to dive down from the sky upon arrival. Climbing down from the Black Griffin, Michael wasted no time in storing as many undead as he could fit into his storage space before summoning Lucky. Even though he would only be leaving the land of origin for a brief moment, just seconds or minutes, his body would remain defenseless in this world, which left him feeling uneasy. So he summoned Lucky for added protection. With both Lucky and the Black Griffin by his side, Michael finally felt a sense of security. Leaving behind a few mental commands, he emphasized one above all. If they encountered something they couldn't handle, they were to carry him away immediately. Once everything was set, Michael sat on the ground in a lotus position and connected his consciousness to his body in the real world. Soon, a pair of green eyes flickered open. This method of movement is such a hassle, we can't even protect our bodies ourselves. I wonder if that changes with rank advancement. Michael muttered in frustration as he stood up. He couldn't help but feel irritated. His intelligence, while not making him a genius or giving him an extraordinary memory, allowed for a monstrous level of thought processing. It was one of the reasons why learning wasn't difficult for him, as long as he spent the necessary time, and why he could keep up in battles where dozens of exchanges happened within a second. With that level of brain power, he felt that if it were possible, controlling two bodies simultaneously, though challenging, shouldn't be impossible. However, the consciousness-switching method between the land of origin and the real world didn't work that way. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Michael, who hadn't bothered dismissing the undead in his room, since she would continue her work once he was done here, leaped out of his apartment window. It was bright outside. Noon. The streets weren't as empty as they had been in the early morning when the city resembled a ghost town, but the people were still spaced out, leaving plenty of blind spots for Michael to do what he needed. At first, no one noticed anything unusual, but as time passed, someone couldn't help but ask, "Aren't that guy's summons looking a bit more than before?" Even in the real world, the general public referred to Michael's undead as summons. This was unavoidable. The ability to summon and dismiss magical beings fit the role of a summoner more than it did a necromancer, at least in the eyes of the general public. Then more questions followed. Why are those figures gray? Yeah, they look like those beautiful female summons, except they're male, and kind of scary for some reason. They do look intimidating. Is it just me, or do they actually look oddly good-looking? For a brief moment, conversations erupted left and right as people speculated about his summons. Then, as expected, phones came out. Some started recording, others took pictures. And just like that, Michael found himself indirectly famous on the internet again. His summons, especially the strange-looking ones, were the main attraction, drawing all the attention. From start to finish, Michael never once revealed his face. Even if he had wanted to, it was already too late. By now, he was back in the land of origin, soaring through the skies on his undead griffin as he hurried to catch up with the flying ship carrying Mage Lion and the Kingdom Knights. Michael and his undead griffin sped through the sky at an extremely fast pace. After a few flying experiences, Michael no longer had any real limits when it came to flight. Because of this, and the fact that he was in a hurry to make it back to the ship on time, he didn't spare a single thought about his current speed or altitude. Fortunately for him, after a while of flying, he spotted a familiar flying ship in the distance. As he drew closer, his heart relaxed. It was indeed the ship he had left behind. At the same time, Michael spotted the flying ship. Some of the sharper and more observant occupants aboard also noticed him. The first was Mage Lion, who had already sensed Michael before anyone else. The reason wasn't anything complicated. The combined aura of both summoner and summon was so powerful that it practically screamed to be noticed. The moment Michael reached the top of the flying ship, he dismissed his undead griffin into his storage space and gracefully landed on the deck, where the knights stared at him in awe. Michael waved and nodded to those who greeted him as he made his way toward Mage Lion. "Are you done with your issues, Sir Mike?" "Yes, thank you very much for waiting." Michael was genuinely grateful. Though he would always prioritize his undead, only heaven knew if he would ever again have such a conveniently smooth connection with the natives of this world as he did now. It was something worth treasuring. "It's okay," Mage Lion said with a smile. "Since Sir Mike is here now, there's no need to wait any longer. I go full speed." He shouted the command to the knights stationed in the driving section on the ship's roof, and with that, the vessel surged forward at maximum speed. Before the ship surged forward at full speed, Michael sensed mana coating its entire structure. And then boom! The scenery around them blurred as the ship accelerated at an incredible pace. A tool is really just a tool, Michael couldn't help but think. The ship's full speed far outstripped that of his undead griffin, and he had a strong suspicion that this wasn't even its maximum potential. Regardless, It was already faster than it had ever been since he first boarded, making Michael thankful that he had returned in time. Had he been even a little late, he would have completely missed his chance. Originally, he had assumed he could catch up if necessary, but seeing the ship's speed now, he realized just how wrong he had been. At the same time, he couldn't help but sigh at the sheer prosperity of the kingdom Mage Lion served. Flying ship. Rank rare. A 3-star rare rank item. The price was something Michael couldn't even begin to fathom, but he suspected that if the Supers Association branch in the real world were to sell it, its value, given its utility, purpose, and apparent rarity, would easily start at a minimum of $100 million. For a kingdom to possess such an asset, along with individuals like Mage Lion, who was essentially a god in the eyes of commoners, it was clearly far from ordinary. Michael's expectations for their destination grew even higher. In the end, Mage Lion and Michael exchanged only a few words before parting ways. Their brief discussion covered a few minor topics, but the main focus remained on their deal regarding the natural treasure. According to Mage Lion, they would head to the treasure's location only after reporting the Blackstone Town incident to the kingdom. This matter took priority and couldn't be delayed. Though Michael was eager to get his hands on the fruit, he understood the reasoning. No one knew how long it would take to acquire the treasure, or if they could even obtain it at all. However, delaying the report about that monster for a treasure that wasn't going anywhere would be reckless. Mage Lion assured him that the treasure's location wasn't easy to find. He had personally ensured that much. Still, if anything were to happen due to the delay, he would be held responsible, and though he hadn't explicitly stated it, Michael could tell it wouldn't end well for him, despite the status his power granted him. With all these factors in mind, Michael had no choice but to wait until they reached the capital. Fortunately, as someone visiting this world from another, the capital was a place he was genuinely looking forward to seeing. He could only hope everything went well in the end. After saying what he needed to, Mage Lion, feeling satisfied, made his way to his room on the flying ship. He believed he had struck a good deal. Michael had brought him plenty of surprises, but fortunately, they had all been pleasant ones. Though he had to come to terms with the fact that this youth was stronger than him, he also felt reassured. Others might call him foolish for choosing to explore with a stranger rather than seek help from people he had known for decades. However, only Mage Lion understood that he was making the same decision that even his fellow court mages, powerhouses in their own right, would have made. To the common people, those at their level were like divine beings, but to the true titans of the kingdom, they were no different from ants. The power gap was unfathomable, but it was the reality. Asking for help from those individuals often felt like carving a piece of flesh from one's own body as payment, something rarely worth the cost. Michael might not have confirmed it, but Mage Lion knew that the soul fruits also held some benefits for those above his level. The effects weren't as pronounced, but what if one of those higher beings took an interest in the fruit? According to the records Mage Lion had studied, the soul fruit could be consumed multiple times, though its effects weakened after the first use. Before he had been forced to flee from the creatures guarding it, Mage Lion had seen 3 of the fruits. That was an incredibly high number, and there was even a chance that more existed. If the records were accurate, consuming just one would allow him to advance significantly, making him no longer one of the weakest in the kingdom's court, if he were to take all of them. However, Mage Lion was not an overly greedy man. If he were, he wouldn't have even considered sharing the fruits, regardless of the danger. Fortunately, thanks to his cooperation with Michael, it seemed he might still secure a significant share. He could only hope their collaboration went smoothly. While those higher-ranked powerhouses would never harm one of their own, Mage Lion had no desire to owe them any favors. After Mage Lion left, Michael also made his way to his room after a while. According to the knights, they would reach the kingdom's capital in about 5 hours. Hearing this, Michael almost blurted out in shock. Just how far was the capital? One couldn't forget that they were currently traveling at an incredible speed, far beyond even Michael's own flash-like movement, especially on the surface. Yet even at such a pace, it would still take 5 hours to reach their destination. If there were no flying ships, wouldn't this journey take months for the average person? Michael was stunned, but also relieved that he had people around him to make things easier. Fortunately, he had taken his undead to the real world beforehand. If he had left them behind and needed to return alone to retrieve them, the journey would have been unimaginably difficult. No, given that monster's presence, he wasn't even sure he would make it back to see any of his undead standing. However, now that he didn't have much to worry about, he could do whatever he wanted, so long as he didn't dwell on what that monster was doing. At first, he had wanted to kill it himself, but now, Michael would love it if someone else just took care of it already. Still, all he could do was wait and see what the future held, and what the kingdom, to whom this matter truly belonged, had planned. Back in his room, knowing he'd be on the ship for the next few hours, Michael didn't want to sit idly by. He needed to do something productive, anything at all, rather than simply wasting time. After thinking for a moment, he finally made a decision. At first, he considered practicing with his spear again, but quickly dismissed the thought. The room was too small, and while he could practice, it would be far too limiting. The same issue applied to the night breathing method. The technique required precise movements, and performing them in such a confined space wasn't feasible. With those options ruled out, there were only a few things left he could do. In the end, he settled on cultivation. The mage meditation technique didn't require movement or complicated steps. He could do it while sitting, standing, or even lying down, as long as he remained still. Unlike the night breathing method, which had limited benefits for him at the moment, meditation was a perfect fit. The room he had been given was well furnished, with an actual bed, not just a wooden frame, but a proper one designed for comfort. Everything was clean, a sign that the ship was well maintained and regularly tidied. Michael didn't think much of it and simply sat on the bed. Closing his eyes, he quickly entered a meditative state. Soon, a familiar sensation of pleasure washed over him, and before he knew it, he was lost in time. Michael had no idea how much time had passed, but it wasn't until he heard a knock at his door that he finally emerged from his meditation. As he came out of his state, several notifications flashed before his eyes. His abilities had improved slightly, though only by minor levels. It wasn't much, but he had expected that. Meditation had merely been a way to pass the time, though he had to admit, the sensation that came with it was quite addictive. "Sir Mike," a voice called from the other side of the door, capturing Michael's attention. "What's the matter?" he asked, getting off the bed and heading toward the door. "Lord Lion instructed me to inform you that we've arrived at our destination." Michael paused. "The capital?" "Yes, sir. We've arrived and will be landing soon." As the knight finished speaking, Michael opened the door, stepping out with a calm expression. "Please lead me to Lord Lion," he instructed. "Yes, Sir Mike. I apologize if I disturbed your rest." "It's not an issue. You didn't disturb anything." Michael put the knight at ease. "Lord Lion is currently at the exit point of the ship, waiting for us to land. Please follow me, Sir Mike." "Yes," Michael responded, stepping forward without hesitation. Green City, the capital of the Lionheart Kingdom. Green City wasn't always the kingdom's capital. A few centuries ago, the third king of the Lionheart family slew a dragon on this very land. Dragons, creatures closest to nature, were both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Their mere presence demanded reverence, and their power was legendary. Using the slain dragon's blood, the third king blessed the land, causing its mana density to surge. With the help of his wife, the third queen, a grand mage specializing in formations, the royal family relocated from the previous capital to this land. By sealing the enriched mana within the region and harnessing the blessing of a dragon that had mastered a law, the Lionheart family, once mere rulers of a small kingdom within the empire, transformed into a formidable force. Their power struck fear into many, and as a consequence, their descendants led the kingdom to its current peak. Now, the Lionheart kingdom stood among the three most powerful kingdoms in the empire. If not for their relatively short history, they might have been the strongest of all. Even so, their rise to prominence was nothing short of remarkable. And it all began with the courage and ambition of the third king and queen. "The third king and queen are really amazing," Michael murmured, a hint of awe in his voice. His gaze lingered on the massive stone statues before him. They were intricately detailed, almost lifelike, capturing the essence of the legendary rulers who had reshaped the fate of his kingdom. The statues of the third king and queen stood towering over the grand plaza at the heart of Green City. Carved from a single, immense slab of mana-infused stone, they radiated an almost tangible presence, as if the figures themselves still watched over the kingdom they had forged. The third king was depicted in his battle stance, clad in intricately detailed armor that bore the crest of the Lionheart family. His right hand rested on the pommel of a colossal greatsword, its blade half buried in the stone beneath him, symbolizing both his strength and his conquest. His face was stern, yet regal, with sharp, chiseled features that exuded authority. A long, flowing cape, sculpted to appear as if caught in the wind, trailed behind him, further emphasizing his commanding aura. Beside him, the third queen was equally imposing, standing tall with her hands raised in a weaving gesture, as if casting a spell. Her robes, though sculpted from stone, seemed to ripple like flowing silk, layered with intricate arcane symbols. Her face, unlike the king's stoic countenance, bore a serene yet resolute expression, wise, graceful, and unyielding. Between the two statues, a carved dragon's skull rested at their feet, split in two, forever commemorating their legendary battle. Yes, Michael was already within the territory of the kingdom. No, he was at the very heart of it, the capital. Due to his identity, Michael had not been permitted to follow the knights to the designated landing spot of the flying ship. Instead, he exited alongside Mage Lion through the open exit of the vessel, taking a far more direct approach. He could still recall the look of shock on Mage Lion's face when he freefell from the sky, landing on the ground completely unharmed. Ignoring the slight pain that briefly flared through his body, Michael still considered it a worthwhile trade-off after seeing the expression of shock on Mage Lion's face. He didn't mean to show off, but the feeling felt good. At the very least, the stunt confirmed that, by normal standards, he was now incredibly hard to kill. As for Mage Lion, his odd stare wasn't just because of Michael's reckless descent, but also due to something else: his sheer physical resilience. Even as a mage, Mage Lion himself wouldn't have died from such a fall. However, it would have been far more than just painful. The fact that Michael had shaken it off so easily made him reassess the young man's true capabilities. After that moment, the two entered the capital through a special gate, which granted them immediate access to the inner city. Thanks to Mage Lion, who had taken it upon himself to be a proper host, Michael was able to learn more about his current location. The capital was divided into three major regions. The outer city, the largest and most populated section, housing commoners, merchants, and lower-ranking officials. The inner city, a wealthier and more regulated district where high-ranking mages, knights, and government officials resided. It was also the heart of trade and commerce. The core, the most exclusive and heavily guarded area, where the kingdom's most powerful figures lived, like the nobles and, most importantly, the royal family. This region contained the palace, the royal academy, and various elite establishments that few could enter without the proper status or invitation. Michael took it all in. The inner city that is as this was where his fake identity could even get him to, his gaze sweeping across the vast cityscape. This place was massive, and for the first time since arriving in this world, he felt the weight of its true scale. It was magnificent. Have to excuse me, Sir Mike, but I'll need to enter the core area of the capital to make my report to the king. I wonder if you'll need my assistance in finding a place to stay. Hearing this, Michael's expression flickered with conflict. He was genuinely grateful to the old mage for giving him such a convenient identity, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was taking too much advantage of the situation. Like right now. Ideally, it would be best if Mage Lion took charge of his accommodations. Because currently, Michael was broke. What he hadn't expected, however, was, "Excuse me, Sir Mike, and please take no offense, but are you perhaps broke?" For a moment, Michael felt like the sky had never looked more beautiful. Was it just him, or did the birds in the sky seem to be laughing at him? Surely, that was just an illusion. Right, in the end, under the assumption that this young man had left his family under some odd circumstances, Mage Lion handed Michael some money before leaving. 10 gold coins and 30 silver. Now alone, Michael found a quiet corner in a restaurant and finally took a proper look at the pouch. He counted the coins carefully. A gold coin. Gold coin kingdom of Lionheart currency. There was no further explanation. Not that he needed one. The coin's appearance alone made its purpose clear. Money. However, what he wasn't sure of was how valuable these coins actually were. It wasn't that he doubted their value, far from it. Given the way Mage Lion treated him, he doubted the old mage would give him something too small to be useful or too large to seem excessive. But that was just his assumption. Who knew what kind of person Mage Lion really was? Michael had only known him for a few hours. Still, if the rules of value in this world were similar to those in Aurora or Earth, then gold and silver had to be worth quite a lot. "Excuse me, sir, is there something you'd like to order?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. Michael looked up. A young woman stood before him, dressed in a black gown with a white inner lining, giving off the air of a noble attendant. She wasn't the only one dressed this way. All the staff in the restaurant, regardless of gender, were similarly well dressed. It was a small but clear sign. This restaurant wasn't ordinary. Of course, that much should have been obvious. This was the inner city of the capital. Anyone who could set foot in this region was capable. Not everyone was a scam like him. Michael thought for a moment, then responded, "What do you offer here?" Still maintaining her professional smile, the attendant gracefully listed the dishes along with their prices. Michael's expression didn't change, but internally he was frowning. Every single dish was priced in silver. Did that mean there was no lower currency? Was silver just that common, or was it the weakest form of currency here? Or was this restaurant just that high-end? It was in the inner city, after all. Michael had tested the silver coins in his pouch. They were real. He refused to believe they were so common that even a casual meal demanded silver. In the end, he ordered a dish worth 3 silver coins. 1, he was curious about the food. 2, it was one of the cheapest options available. Fortunately, his order didn't seem unusual, or maybe the attendant was just too good at hiding her reaction. Either way, Michael wasn't about to spend money carelessly. He was broke. Until Mage Lion helped him, he could almost smell it. As he waited for his food after paying, Ignoring the attendant who lingered a little longer than necessary, probably expecting a tip, Michael reorganized his thoughts. He wasn't sure how long he'd stay in the capital city, but even after dealing with the monster issue, he had a feeling it would take some time. Thanks to Mage Lion being a good host, Michael had learned about some of the notable establishments in the capital. Among them two stood out, the Hunters Guild and the Adventurers Guild. Between the two, Michael was a little more familiar with the latter. Though Mage Lion hadn't gone into much detail, probably expecting Michael to be aware of common knowledge, he had still managed to piece together some useful information. First, the Adventurers Guild was exactly what he had expected, a place where individuals, known as adventurers, accepted quests in exchange for payment. The Hunters Guild, on the other hand, functioned more like a hunting club. They gathered information about monsters, had people eliminate them, paid a small fee, and then purchased the corpses for their own purposes. Of the two, the Hunters Guild seemed far more dangerous, but also far more appealing. If there was one thing attractive to any awakener, it was experience points. And from what he gathered, the Hunters Guild seemed like the perfect place to provide exactly that. If they had information on monster gatherings or particularly powerful creatures, then the speed at which he could gain experience in the land of origin might actually compare to, or even surpass, his rate of growth in the real world. The land of origin lacked certain advantages the Federation had, but it also possessed opportunities that the Federation didn't. However, it was too soon to judge. Still, Michael had already made his decision. After this meal, he was heading straight to the Hunters Guild. It was located outside the inner city, but thankfully, Mage Lion had not only given him money, but also a token that allowed him free access between the inner and outer city. As for why both the Hunters Guild and the Adventurers Guild were located outside the inner city, Michael figured it was a matter of accessibility. After all, the inner city wasn't a place just anyone could enter. Michael's situation was a bit different. The honest truth was, even without Mage Lion's intervention, entering the inner city wouldn't have been an issue for him if he had chosen to reveal his power. With power came status. But there were far too many things that could go wrong with that approach. Not that his current situation was completely problem-free, but so far, things had been going smoothly, no major issues yet. The Adventurers Guild and Hunters Guild are also good ways to integrate better into this world. Aside from that, they can serve as a steady source of income. The more Michael thought about it, the more convinced he became that his current direction was the best, at least for now. As he continued pondering, his thoughts drifted between various matters: his future in the land of origin, his real-world circumstances, and even more pressing concerns like his undead and the corpses he had left behind in Evermoon Forest. Before he knew it, he had been lost in thought for quite some time. It wasn't until the aroma of freshly prepared food reached him that he realized his meal had finally arrived. The food, once again, did not fail to satisfy Michael. "It tastes great," he murmured, savoring the flavors, "but not better than what I had at the town mayor's place." He didn't find this surprising. The chef at the mayor's residence was undoubtedly skilled, but this establishment was designed specifically for serving food. While both prepared meals, their purposes were fundamentally different. One crafted dishes tailored to an employer's tastes, while the other focused on efficiency and service for a wider audience. The distinction might seem subtle, but it made all the difference. Of course, that wasn't to say a restaurant couldn't serve exceptional food. However, the mayor's chef likely had more time and freedom to perfect each dish, unlike the cooks here, who probably worked in a structured, step-by-step process divided among multiple hands. However, whether this dish was truly worth the silver coins it had cost was something Michael was unsure of. That said, it did seem like something the average man wouldn't be able to afford frequently. This realization made him reassess a few things. After finishing his meal, Michael didn't linger in the restaurant for long before leaving. There was no need to sit back and wait for his food to digest. His body's powerful system had already begun processing it the moment he ate. Once outside, he took in his surroundings as he wandered through the streets. The floors were immaculately clean, paved with stone tiles arranged in an orderly fashion. The people walking around looked refined, their demeanor exuding a certain air of sophistication. Occasionally, Michael spotted individuals accompanied by knights in polished armor or expensive-looking horse-drawn carriages passing by. Fortunately, he didn't seem too out of place, though he did earn a few glances due to his appearance. The mayor of Blackstone Town had indeed gone all out with the little time he had to craft Michael's attire. As Michael had expected, the material was of excellent quality. His outfit, primarily an azure green color with black accents, paired well with his striking green eyes, ensuring that he drew his fair share of attention wherever he went. It had been the same in the restaurant he had just left, though the attention there had been more subtle, given that he had chosen a secluded corner and kept his presence low. Michael paid no mind to the glances he received. After strolling through the inner city for a bit, he turned and started making his way toward the location of the inner city's exit. It wasn't hard to spot. The capital was structured in layers, with territories divided by massive walls. From the outer city to the core area, each section had its own barrier. The first and outermost wall encompassed the entirety of the capital's territory. Within that, two more concentric walls marked the divisions between the outer city, the inner city, and the core area. All three walls were enormous, visible from any point within their respective territories. Michael only had to locate a section of the wall where the height was slightly lower. That was where the gates were located. It didn't take long for Michael to reach the gate. The structure was massive, built from thick iron and currently stood wide open. Around it, a group of knights in armor were stationed at different points, keeping watch. Even without using detect, Michael's sharp senses picked up on the auras of the knights around him. If he were to gauge their strength, they all seemed to be at the level of early rank 1. This was impressive. It revealed a glimpse of the kingdom's power. Even the gatekeepers were rank 1 humans, though they seemed slightly weaker compared to the knights Michael had traveled with. This realization made him understand just how elite that group must have been, even within the kingdom's forces. The gate's passageway was wide, with separate lanes for those entering and exiting. A few knights were questioning and searching the people coming in, but those leaving were allowed to pass freely. Michael figured this was because there was no real need to stop those heading out. The very fact that someone was in the inner city to begin with meant they had entered through proper channels, whether by passing this checkpoint or through some other means. After a quick glance at the process, Michael made his way toward the outer city. Fortunately, he wasn't stopped, though he did earn a few curious looks. The moment he stepped out of the inner city, he felt a distinct change. The mana density in the air is lower. In fact, this was something he had noticed upon first entering the capital, the difference in mana between regions. The inner city had a noticeably higher concentration of mana compared to the outer city, and even the outer city's mana was slightly denser than the lands beyond the capital. I wonder how it is in the core area. For a brief moment, Michael imagined cultivating in an environment with such rich mana, especially with a high-rank meditation technique. It had to be far better than what he was using now, where gaining even a single point in his intelligence stat could take an entire year. Perhaps for those at the absolute peak, where a single stat point was worth more than all of Michael's combined, such a long period of time was acceptable. But he wasn't at that stage yet. He was interested in cultivating, but only if it provided real benefits. For now, it felt like a great way to pass the time, and for some reason it was oddly addictive. The difference between the inner and outer city became immediately clear the moment Michael stepped outside. The roads, for example, were inconsistent. Some were paved with stone tiles, while others were simple dirt paths. The noise level was noticeably higher, and the overall cleanliness was lacking in comparison. The people, too, were different. There were far fewer refined individuals, and in their place were more commoners going about their daily lives. Compared to the inner city, Michael drew even more attention here. His attire and presence stood out amidst the crowd. However, like before, he didn't mind. Instead, he focused on gathering information, asking for directions to both the Hunter Guild and the Adventurers Guild. After getting a lead, Michael immediately set off toward his first destination, the Hunter Guild. As he walked down the streets of the outer city, his unfamiliarity with the area was obvious, and he could feel countless gazes on him. What puzzled him, however, was that mixed within those gazes were traces of ill intent. What confused him even more was that, when he turned to identify the sources, he found that almost all of them came from children or people around his age. From the children, the emotions he sensed were a strange mixture of hatred, longing, and awe. From the older ones, however, the feelings were much darker: hatred, greed, envy, jealousy, and a general sense of resentment. All of this left Michael confused. He couldn't recall offending anyone since arriving in the land of origin, aside from a particular monster that seemed obsessed with wrapping its tentacles around him. What Michael didn't know, or perhaps hadn't fully grasped, despite his past life, was the reality of a world where nobles and commoners existed. Perhaps he understood it on some level but hadn't truly realized it yet, still in the process of adapting. When he did, the first thought that would come to his mind was how eerily similar it was to the dark ages of Aurora. Whenever a divide formed between people, changes inevitably followed. The rich and the poor. A wealthy person and someone slightly better off. It didn't always have to be extreme. Even within the same group, hierarchies naturally emerged. But when it came to nobles and commoners, the divide could be far worse. Nobles, the so-called superior beings, valued noble blood above all. Commoners, on the other hand, were regarded as people of lesser worth. The land of origin was far from an ideal world, and soon enough, Michael would come to realize just how deeply these divisions influenced human relationships, especially now that he carried the identity he did. As Michael walked toward his destination, he paid no mind to the people trailing behind him. Meanwhile, in a dark corner, two older-looking boys whispered to each other. "Are we really going to try robbing a noble again, Leah? I know you hate nobles because of what happened to your—" The shorter of the two suddenly cut himself off when the boy he was speaking to shot him a sharp glare. But after a brief hesitation, a determined expression settled on his face. "I know you hate nobles because of what happened to Lyra. She's your sister, and though we aren't blood related, she was like one to me too. But it was because of this that Tim died the last time we tried this. And that wasn't even long ago, it was just a week ago, Leah. What do you think stealing from a noble will do to them? Nothing. It'll only cause trouble for us. Sure, we might gather enough money to enter a dojo and learn the ways of a knight, but isn't this too risky?" A conflicted look finally appeared on the taller boy's face, but it was fleeting. Soon, it was replaced by unwavering determination. Seeing this, the shorter boy sighed. "This is the last time, Leah. The last time," he muttered, seemingly resigned to following his friend down this path once again. For a brief moment, a smile flickered across the taller boy's face before vanishing, replaced by pure hatred. "I'll use your wealth to gain power, and then I'll use that power to kill all you damn nobles," he thought, his eyes burning with loathing. Oblivious to the tragic stories trailing behind him, Michael finally arrived at his destination. Although the outer city, by its very nature, seemed inferior to the inner city, it wasn't entirely stricken with poverty. There were a few establishments that stood out, larger and more refined than their surroundings, but none compared to the one before Michael. The Hunter Guild. A massive signpost stood at the entrance of the building. Though Michael didn't recognize the characters, he instinctively knew what they meant. The building itself was among the largest he had seen in this world, even surpassing some in the inner city. Standing 6 stories tall, its exterior was coated in black, brown, and hints of red, giving it a solemn and imposing appearance. Taking a deep breath, Michael hesitated no longer and stepped inside. Immediately, a rush of sounds assaulted his ears. For a moment, it reminded him of the first time he had entered a Supers Association branch. Outside it had been quiet, inside it was anything but. However, unlike in the real world here, Michael could sense the distinct traces of mana lingering in the air. Sound magic. This wasn't Michael's first encounter with it in this world. The flying ship he had taken with Mage Lion had used the same effect. After recovering from the sudden noise that assaulted his sharp hearing, catching him off guard, Michael turned to take in his surroundings. The next moment, an odd expression appeared on his face. The first floor of the Hunters Guild looked like a bar. Rough-looking men and women, both in armor and casual wear, filled the space as they drank, ate, and made noise. With his heightened senses, Michael could detect a wide range of varying strengths, but none of them were stronger than him. As he observed the guild's first floor, several people turned to look at him. Some gave him a quick glance before returning to their business, while others pointed at him and began discussing him as a topic of interest. A few simply stared. Michael frowned slightly at the rude gestures directed at him but chose to ignore them. Instead, he made his way to the reception desk, where several attendants dressed in formal clothing were seated. Without hesitation, he approached one of them and got straight to the point. "Good morning. I'd like to register as a hunter and learn about the requirements for joining." Michael's voice wasn't particularly loud, yet somehow it echoed throughout the area. Even the receptionist he had addressed froze momentarily, seemingly caught off guard. But before she could respond, a loud burst of laughter suddenly erupted. At present, Michael wasn't feeling the greatest. Ever since he entered the Hunters Guild, it felt like one thing after another kept happening, even though barely a minute had passed. This only went to show how heavy an impression he had made in such a short span of time. Michael turned to look at the person who had just burst into laughter. It was a man behind him. The man was built like a bear, far taller than Michael, casting a shadow over him. Had it been someone with a weak mindset, this might have been intimidating. However, the current Michael was far from intimidated. He was pissed. "Did I say something funny?" Michael asked in a calm tone. But it seemed his words only made the rough-looking man laugh harder. At this point, the first floor of the Hunters Guild had grown noticeably quieter. Almost everyone now had their eyes on Michael's location. It felt like they were watching a show. Michael's frown deepened. He was just about to ignore the man and continue with what he was doing when the man finally spoke. "Did I just hear you say you want to register as a hunter?" The man's voice was loud, his breath unpleasant, and it was obvious he was drunk. Michael frowned but still answered, "Yes, is there a problem with that?" Though he wouldn't pride himself on being able to read people accurately, something about the way the man spoke and acted threw Michael off. A part of him wanted to know why. Another part wanted to send a punch straight into his face. The last time he had been this affected by someone's behavior was when he met his neighbor's nephew, whose father had died due to the demonic supernatural's plan. These two had something in common. The way they spoke made one want to punch them. Hearing Michael's response, the rough-looking man only laughed harder. However, what Michael noticed was that the gazes directed at him from the others had changed. Most weren't exactly filled with hostility, but they weren't positive either. It felt more like he was being looked down on. "People, are you hearing what this great noble is saying? He says he wants to be a hunter. A tiny boy like this wants to be a hunter. Ha ha ha." The man spoke in broken sentences, something Michael could clearly pick up on. What made him feel uncomfortable, though, was how others joined in the laughter. From the man's words, Michael was starting to understand a bit more about the reactions around him. Though still somewhat puzzled, he didn't mind others having opinions of him. However, he didn't quite like being the topic of discussion. In the end, after a brief moment of thought, Michael decided to ignore the other party. He was just about to turn back to the receptionist and continue where he left off when he suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder. "Boy, I was talking to you." Michael paused. Slowly, he turned his head to stare behind him. "Don't call me that, and don't touch me." Michael wasn't particularly angered by being called boy. People in the real world had called him that before, like Brian, for example. However, those were people who gave him due respect. And respect was the last thing this man had given him. Michael's eyes darkened. The heavy hand on his shoulder was unwelcome, but the sheer audacity of the man made it worse. The moment Michael had warned him, he expected the fool to step back. Instead, the man only grinned wider. "Oh, and what are you gonna do about it, noble boy?" The man's breath stank of alcohol, but Michael barely registered it. He had already decided. Before the man could react, Michael's hand shot up like a viper, grabbing the drunkard's wrist. Then, crack! A deafening boom echoed as Michael's grip forced the man's entire arm downward. A scream erupted from the rough-looking man as his massive body slammed into the ground. The floorboards beneath them groaned from the sheer force. Gasps filled the air. The onlookers who had been watching for entertainment suddenly felt their smiles freeze. 1 second, the man had been standing over Michael, mocking him. The next, he was being thrown around like a rag doll. Michael barely gave him time to recover. Before the man could even groan in pain, Michael twisted his wrist again, flipping him over like a sack of grain and slamming him into the floor once more. Boom! A few tables shook. Mugs of ale spilled over. At that moment, it was no longer just gasps. Some of the onlookers even flinched. The Hunters Guild wasn't a place for the weak, and most of the people present weren't strangers to combat. But what they had just witnessed, Michael hadn't used a single ounce of visible strength, yet he had turned a bear of a man into a plaything. The man groaned in pain, but he still wasn't done. A mixture of rage and humiliation twisted his face as he struggled to get up, reaching for the weapon at his waist. A heavy-looking, rune-carved axe. Michael's eyes narrowed. The moment the man unsheathed the weapon, Michael's foot was already moving. Bang! With a single kick, the man's grip failed and his axe went flying. It didn't just drop. It smashed through a nearby wooden counter, completely ruining one of the tables in the process. Silence fell. The receptionist, who had been watching all this with a stunned expression, gasped. Michael didn't care. He placed his foot firmly on the man's chest, pinning him down. The man struggled but quickly realized he couldn't move. Michael's gaze was indifferent as he stared down at him. "You brought out a weapon," Michael said flatly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like a hammer. "Do you know what that means?" For the first time, the man's face paled. Compared to adventurers, hunters lived noticeably more dangerous lives. So why do they still continue being hunters? The pay was simply better. If given the chance, most people would do anything for money, and hunters were no exception. The kingdom of Lionheart had a strict class structure. While commoners weren't to be mistreated outright, being born as one was already a disadvantage. To them, nobles were distant figures, people they could only admire from afar. Nobility was something to yearn for, but was almost impossible to attain. Even wealthier commoners who lived comfortable lives still felt this divide. Yet, while this reality made many commoners respect nobles, it also made a good number of them resent and even hate them. It didn't help that not all nobles were actually noble in character. The Hunters' Guild and the Adventurers' Guild were among the few places where commoners could acquire wealth, power, and status. High-ranking adventurers and hunters were said to be treated no less than nobles, even by nobles themselves. This was why, despite the dangerous nature of the job, people still flocked to join the guilds. However, it wasn't easy. To avoid overcrowding, registering required an expensive fee paid with silver, a huge obstacle for most. The situation was even more complicated. Since being an adventurer or hunter required supernatural abilities to succeed, many would rather spend their hard-earned silver on dojo training to gain access to the supernatural world first. It created a conflicting cycle. Pay to earn wealth, then use wealth to gain strength, only to use that strength to earn even more wealth, an endless loop. This was why nearly everyone Michael saw in the guild looked rough, because that was their reality. Just like him. They were broke. They were poor. Weapons needed maintenance. Potions, cultivation resources, everything cost money. Whether one was a hunter or an adventurer, it was a never-ending cycle. The path promised riches and power, but the journey itself could be brutal. This was why most hunters and adventurers tended to have a certain rough edge to them. Or, as the nobles called them with disdain, barbaric brutes. The drunkard approaching Michael wasn't just any hunter. He was one of the many commoners who despised nobles. For people like him, life had always been an uphill battle. From the moment of birth, a commoner's future was set in stone. Struggle, toil, and hope for a miracle that would likely never come. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they risked their lives in the wilds hunting monsters or in the wild seeking treasures, they would always be at a disadvantage. Meanwhile, nobles were handed everything on a silver platter. Wealth, power, status, connections. They didn't need to risk their lives to gain strength. From birth, they had access to the best dojos, the finest mentors, and the rarest resources. Expensive potions that could enhance strength, magical artifacts that could protect against deadly attacks. These were things commoners could only dream of, but for nobles, they were mere conveniences. Even their access to supernatural abilities was different. While commoners had to scrape together everything they had just to afford a chance at awakening their powers, nobles were given elixirs and cultivation manuals from childhood. Some were even born with inherited abilities, making the entire process effortless. And what made it worse? The arrogance. Many nobles looked down on commoners, treating them as nothing more than tools or background characters in their own grand stories. If a noble committed a crime, there was always a way out, a bribe, a connection, or simply the power to ignore the consequences. But if a commoner stepped out of line, punishment was swift and merciless. The drunkard had lived this reality firsthand. He had spent his childhood in the slums, watching his mother work herself to the bone just to keep them alive. He had seen his father, a man who had once been a promising hunter, get crippled in a monster raid, only to be tossed aside by the noble that had used him. And when his sister was taken by a noble for his own twisted amusement. No justice was served, no punishment was given. The noble walked free. That was the world he lived in. That was why he hated nobles. Because no matter how hard commoners fought, nobles had it easy. However, he was blinded by his own hatred, fueled by alcohol, and made the mistake of touching a noble. As if that wasn't bad enough, he had even drawn his weapon. That was why fear gripped him instantly. In his panic, another thought surfaced. Why was the other party so strong? Though he wasn't the most impressive hunter in the guild, he was nearly at the peak of the primary stage. That was plenty strong. At the very least, he wasn't weak when compared to the gate guards. Yet this young man had handled him effortlessly. Even if his cultivation technique was inferior, this shouldn't have been possible if they were at the same power level. That meant only one thing. This noble youth had to be at least at the intermediate stage. And at such a young age. He was screwed. A chilling voice pulled him back to reality. Do you know what that means? Michael's voice sounded like a devil's whisper. Of course he knew what it meant. His face paled. If he had only touched the noble, he might have had a way out. The guild could have stepped in, offering some protection under the guise of supporting one of their own. But the moment he drew his weapon, even the guild wouldn't be able to help him. He might die. The now sober drunkard swallowed his fear as he waited for the noble youth's next words. However, what was he saying? You're going to have to pay for the damages here, all of it. I'm going to pay for damages. The drunkard felt like he had heard wrong. And he wasn't the only one. The crowd, which had been silent in anticipation of a brutal punishment, also felt like they had misheard. Then came Michael's next words, spoken with an almost baffled expression. You don't expect me to pay for the damages caused by you, do you? Are you dumb? Michael, of course, had no plans to kill the man. Putting aside the location, just because he had killed a few people and he was greedy for more special corpses didn't mean he'd do it. It didn't make sense. At least, for the current situation, it didn't. However, Michael had to admit that he might have indeed let his emotions take control of him for a moment. But then again, the man had it coming. What? You're not going to pay for the damages that you caused yourself. As he spoke, Michael couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed, but this was only on the inside. Outwardly, there wasn't a hint of oddness. If one didn't know better, they wouldn't know Michael was trying to scam the injured man to pay for something another person, him, was responsible for. Michael glanced at the man with ill intent. Though he didn't unleash his mana on the other party, he definitely felt intimidated. Yes, I'll pay for the damages. Why are you saying it like you're doing me a favor for your actions? I'm sorry, I'll pay for the damages I caused. The man said with difficulty and an ugly expression on his face. It was unknown how many levels of pain he was currently feeling. Seemingly satisfied by the other party, Michael finally let go of him and turned back to the receptionist's table, but this time chose another person. Though he didn't know if what had just happened was a normal occurrence in the guild, the attitude of the receptionist throughout didn't impress him. He felt that with a warning, the bear-like man might have stopped and come back into his senses, but instead, it seemed she was more worried about the other party than he, who was harassed. After a few experiences, Michael was starting to understand a few things about this world, or rather, the reality of the identity tied to him. It started from the town mayor's residence. If Michael didn't realize after so much happened, then he was more than slow. After a few experiences here, Michael had reasons to believe that the part of the land of origin he was in seemed to be heavily based on social status. With a modern mindset, though, he wouldn't be naive enough to say there was no difference between the poor and rich. As long as it was not a cultivator and a human, all humans were the same. One was just better at something than the other person, or had something more than the other person. But in this world, it was a bit different. Just a title, noble and commoner, gave Michael the feeling of what would have happened in the real world had the Federation let the demonic cultivators rule the world like they wanted to. However, as a supernatural being himself, he still felt conflicted about how to feel. But whatever the case may be, now was not the time to think about it. Michael wanted to register as a hunter and proceed with his plans. "I want to register as a hunter. What do I need to do?" Michael asked again, this time more direct. Fortunately, there was no laughter that followed, or rather, no one dared to laugh. Though some might not despise nobles like the drunk hunter, and might even be worse, as hunters, what they recognized the most was strength, and that was what the youth had. Respect needed to be given. This, and no one wanted to be beaten and have to pay for damages. Michael's method had really opened their eyes, and some of them looked like they were inspired by him. First, you need to pay a registration fee. Tell me a few things about yourself so I can list them down, and that's about it. So basically, the most important thing was the registration. In simpler terms, the money. Michael figured this much and immediately asked for the price. 5 silver coins. Without hesitation, he paid. This was just like the restaurant he had just eaten in a place where the price system was already structured. You either paid or you didn't. After receiving the registration fee, the receptionist, who was active and welcoming than the first one Michael had picked upon entering the guild building, started collecting his information. At first, Michael was a little nervous and thought he'd need to bullshit his way through due to so many things like his inability to read and write, the cultures, and so on of this world. But this didn't end up being the case. Michael wasn't writing anything and only needed to answer some questions, and said questions also weren't too hard for him to provide an answer to. Name: Mike Noor. Age. When it reached this point, Michael had noticed more than one person seemed to be focused on his location. He didn't care and gave his answer. I'm 18. Technically, the body in the land of origin was a week old, but for obvious reasons, Michael couldn't say this. The moment his age was reviewed, several gasps echoed in the first floor of the Hunter Guild building. Michael could also see the receptionist was visibly surprised, but fortunately, she was professional and kept on with the questions. What are you good at? Good as in your specialty. This helps in a few ways, like when looking for a teammate and vice versa, the guild can recommend. Oh. Michael immediately understood. It felt like when Grace, in the Supers Association branch, had helped him with applying for entries into cracks via teammates who had them. They weren't the same thing, but the system of recommendation seemed to be about the same thing. Michael only thought for a moment before responding. Combat, I'm good at fighting, that's something, right? To be sure, Michael asked after giving his answer, and the receptionist at the counter responded positively. Following this, after a few back and forth easy questioning and answering, Michael was finally able to complete his registration. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story. And if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.